We're starting a new series, and I'm pretty excited about this series. Excited might be a tough word, but anytime you start looking at our deficiencies, it's kind of hard to be excited about that. But that is a good thing, because if we just kind of come in touch with who we really are, the exciting part is really embracing this whole concept of grace, that we're at our best, or God is at its best, God's best when we're not. And that's just kind of how our faith works. And so we're talking about how to drink from the same cup that Jesus drinks from. And it comes out of the text in Matthew 20. And there's a nice story. We're going to kind of go through that story this time. But I always like to stop and think about the actions of the disciples. And the fact that they failed miserably should really make us feel good about who we are as people. And if you think about the disciples, they have been working side by side with Jesus. I want you to visualize that for a better part of 3 years, next to Jesus, okay? They knew things about Jesus that nobody else could ever know. They knew more about him than anybody else in the history of this world. They got to experience and see things, not just miracles, right? That's funny for sometimes, but they got to see his personality. They got to see his demeanor. You got to see how he treated people from every walk of life, whether or not they were part of the faith or had been excluded from their faith or were even enemies of the faith. They got to observe the respect and the compassion that Jesus gave all of these people. And they even argue with them from time to time the way he reached out to people when they didn't deserve it. They had to be so many times that they were with Jesus, I just kind of stop back and say, what? That's amazing what he's doing. The disciples had a front row ticket to the Son of God. Yet, at the end of that 3-year tour with him, their perception of Jesus and their response to Jesus is really not what I would expect. And I think this final journey to the cross with Jesus really reveals the disciples' weaknesses, their vulnerabilities, their fears, their uncertainties. They thought they could be strong for Jesus, but they were wrong. They couldn't. And we have to remember that these men were closer to the Son of God than anyone else in history. This Lenten season, we're going to walk with the disciples as they stumble their way to Jerusalem with Jesus. They believed that they really could drink from the same cup as Jesus, and they just were not ready to do that. So the question is, what is it about this cup, and what is in that cup that makes it so difficult to swallow, that they weren't able to do it? So our journey to Easter will look at the contents of that cup to determine what it takes to be one of Jesus' true disciples. Let's sing first. The main scripture reading that we're using for this sermon series, comes from Matthew 20. When Jesus had already, Luke says this, set his face to go to Jerusalem. I always loved that image. You know, he was doing his ministry for a good part of 3 years, and then he knew the time had come, and he set his face. You know, Clint Eastwood always comes to mind, you know. John Wayne, you know, looking out there and knowing that's where he needs to do and where he needs to go. And there was nothing that's going to change the direction, that path. And so he'd already set his face to go towards Jerusalem. And so we're going to listen and talk a little bit, break down the scripture step by step to kind of see how this journey begins. So I'm going to start in I don't know what verse we're in. One of the verses in chapter 20. So while Jesus was going up to Jerusalem, he took the 12 disciples aside by themselves, and he said to them on the way, "See, we are going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be handed over to the chief priests, to the scribes, and they will condemn him to death. Then they will hand him over to the Gentiles to be mocked and flogged and crucified. And on the third day, he will be raised." It wasn't that long ago before this reading that Jesus took those disciples aside to be by themselves again in this little town of Caesarea Philippi. That was a very important moment in the life of Jesus' ministry, because they were doing their ministry and doing their touring around and doing things, but then he pulled them aside because he knew he was going to have to go to Jerusalem. The time was hard to move in that direction, but he wanted to make sure that they knew exactly who he was, because that was going to be very instrumental, not just for their journey, but also their journey after Jesus' death and his resurrection. And so it was in this setting that Peter made the famous identity of Jesus when he said to him, "You are the Messiah, you are the Son of the living God." And then Jesus would praise Peter for this statement, and then he told them that the whole foundation of time, of all the church, will be based on this statement. Shortly after that, Jesus told them for the first time, that they're going to make their way now to Jerusalem, where they're going to be turned over to the church leaders, and he's going to suffer and he is going to die. And then Peter once again said, "God forbid it, Lord. This must never happen to you." In that one sentence, Peter turned from the foundation of the church to the church's greatest adversary, as Jesus responded to him, "Get behind me, Satan." Same conversation. Same people. The first lesson that we need to learn on this reading is that the line between church and being Satan isn't as thick as we think. It's a little bit thinner than we realize. The one who was closest to Jesus crossed that line in one simple conversation. We have learned here in this little statement that simply claiming that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of the living God, does not make one a disciple of Jesus any more than sleeping in a Holiday Inn Express makes one a doctor or a pilot. You follow me? Now, in just a few miles down the road from Jerusalem, for the third time, Jesus tells about his suffering and his death. And third time must be the charm, because our story takes a very weird twist. Let's continue the reading. Then the mother of the sons of Zebedee came to him, to Jesus, with her sons. And kneeling before him, she asked a favor of him. And Jesus said to her, "What do you want?" She said to him, "Declare that these two sons of mine will sit one on your right hand and one on your left in your kingdom." Where does mom come from? I mean, it's a boys' night out, right? This is a little trip that Jesus is taking with his 12 disciples, and they're going to sit there and they're going to have a nice, calm talk about what's going to take place. And he's done it once, he's done it twice, he's done it a third time. And all of a sudden, here is Mom showing up. What is this, Little League? Is Jesus not giving those boys enough playing time on his team that Mom has to come and to intervene now? My son's going to be in the major leagues if it weren't for you. How many coaches have heard that? But in all fairness to the mother, this poor mother was really trying to protect her babies. Does any mother ever done that before? Is she the first one in the history of the world to do that? We fathers now are starting to get a little more aggressive in that approach as well. But in all fairness, she's trying to protect her babies. And I cannot imagine the stress that she was under and seeing her boys to accept an invitation to follow this Jesus, whose, first of all, his identity was questioned, much less his motives were questioned, right? I mean, here's a guy who's making the statement, people make the statement, he's the Messiah. And he is the only one that people are supposed to follow, so they're following him. How many Messiahs do you know? And what if one of your children, your grandchildren come to you and say, no, there's a person over there, we think he's the Messiah, I'm going to drop everything, and I'm going to go run off with him. How would that make you feel? Would you get excited? Anybody? There'd be a lot of uncertainty there. There'd be a lot of fear involved with that. And besides that, these boys were leaving the family business to follow this controversial figure who their own church leaders were criticizing, for goodness sake. So you know that brought all sorts of pressure even upon the family there. Not only that, but this person's life was being threatened, so their boys' lives were being threatened. And if she could not talk them out of their decision to follow this guy, the least that she can do was to make sure that they're going to be taken care of, right? It's not hard to imagine how Mom enters the picture. It's not hard to imagine how a parent might be feeling at this time. So the second lesson that we need to take away from this story is this: is God's kingdom. In God's kingdom, blood is not thicker than water. It is not thicker than the waters of our baptism. True disciples of Jesus truly put God as number one in their life. That is so difficult to do. It would be great, it would be special if our families went right along with us, but if not, then we're going to have to choose God over all others and anyone else. And this is hands down the most emotional, guilt-ridden decision you will ever have to make in your life. Choosing God to be number one in your life. Continuing the story. Backing up a little bit, the mother said to him, I want you to declare that these two sons of mine will sit, one on the right and one on the left, in your kingdom. But Jesus answered, you don't know what you're asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I am able to drink? I wonder what James and John thought about that answer. I think it's very obvious as the story plays out that they really didn't know what all that entailed to drink from the cup. We got to remember that they're just like you and I. They're no different. They made a very conscious decision to follow Jesus, just like you and I. First day that comes in our lives, we go, you know what? We really need to go to church. And sometimes we need to go to church and really get our kids in church. And so we all make that certain decision somewhere down the road that we need to make the conscious effort to follow Jesus. But to what extent? To what extent? Because we all have our limitations. We'll go to worship and then we'll get out so no one will tackle us. You know, we have our limitations of what we're able to do to never follow Jesus. So I think we're willing to go and follow down the road, but we're going to get off that bandwagon before it gets to Jerusalem, because we know what happens in Jerusalem. All chaos breaks loose. and then we're going to find ourselves in trouble, and we don't want to be that committed. I think at this point in their faith development, that's where they were. They thought they could make that trip, but their spiritual maturity told them otherwise. Because like all of us, there's two things that prevent us from really becoming a disciple of Jesus. The first one is uncertainty. The second one is fear. I don't know what I'm getting into, and I'm afraid it will take me away from what I really need to do and want to do. Moving on. Then the boys said to Jesus, "We're able to drink from that cup." And Jesus said to them, "You will indeed drink my cup. But to sit on the right and the left, that's not mine to grant. But it's for those for whom it has been prepared by my Father." Third lesson we're going to take from this reading is that spiritual maturity comes with a mixture of three things. There is time, there is effort, and there's bad experiences. That sound weird to you? Time and effort we understand, right? Bad experiences, what are you talking about? Bad experiences. True faith comes from time, comes from effort, comes from bad experiences, because we all have bad experiences. I mean, we try to go through life without experiencing anything bad in our life, right? How well does that work out for you? Huh? There's one waiting right down the road for every one of us. It might be today, it might be tomorrow, it might be next month. But it's there. It's going to happen. And the problem we have with resurrection is that that's something we just think that happens when we die. So we're going to stay around, wait till we die, then we get to go take this highway up to Jesus, right? Resurrection is every time we take those bad experiences in our life and allow God into our hearts and our minds to help us to go through that process. Because those bad experiences that we go through in life is really a way that gives us true access inside the grace and beauty of God. We cannot be afraid of bad experiences of life, because when we turn those bad experiences into new opportunities and see things that make us stronger and better and more mature, that's resurrection. And that's the whole beauty of the Christian faith. Because life says, stay away at all costs of everything that's bad in your life, because you're probably doing something bad that's caused you those problems. So you might as well just drink yourself away or smoke yourself away or run away and stay away from it. The Christian faith says those bad experiences are opportunities for us to grow and to mature in our faith. And if we allow God to be a part of that process, then we're going to become stronger and wiser. And we're going to really have true access to God's grace and God's beauty. We cannot be afraid of bad experiences, because it only brings us closer to the reality of God. That is the greatest thing about our Christian faith. Case in point is our story. Jesus did not get upset at the brothers or the mother, because he could see the immaturity that was there, but he also knew that they would grow out of that negative, bad experience of watching Jesus suffer and die. But they would grow so much from that that they would be willing to die a similar death as their uncertainty and their fear began to vanish. But not now, not in our story, because the story continues. So when the 10 heard this, the other 10 disciples, they were angry with the two brothers. But Jesus called to them and said this, "You know, the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and they're the great ones are tyrants over them. It will not be so among you. Whoever wishes to be great among you must be your servant. Whoever wishes to be first among you must be your slave. Just as the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as ransom for many." See, the 10 disciples are on the same maturity level as the mother and the two brothers. So, it's understandable about their anger in this situation. They also probably wanted the left and wanted the right side of Jesus, and they like all this little political stuff going on behind their back because they thought, well, they're going to get the upper hand because they're kind of in secret telling Jesus what they need to do and maybe slipping them a 5 or something to kind of get there above these other people. But that's just not what's going to happen, because Jesus' response to them was not even in anger. But he just kind of revealed the greatest secret to God's kingdom that remains the greatest struggle for people of faith to accept. And he spells it out in the 4th and final lesson of this passage. And it's this: greatness is a servant. To be first is to be the slave. Serving is why we're here, not to be served. Giving ourselves for others, even those we don't know, is what this faith is about. The mature disciples of Jesus play the role of a servant. I want us to remember that, because a servant conforms to the master. And who is the master that we conform to? Jesus or God. And a servant does not argue with the master. A servant does not have any personal rights. A servant listens intently and does what the master says. A servant gives him or herself to others without any expectations and finds a lot of joy in responding to the master. A servant must submit to the master, must surrender his will to the will of the master, must trust completely in the master's grand design for the world and how they play a part in it. As Peter quickly found out, you cannot reach this level of maturity, of spiritual growth, simply by claiming to be a Christian or that Jesus is the Messiah. But those words are a beginning. And as soon as we go through those multiple bad experiences in life, you will soon be able to recognize and to experience the reality of God. And each time we gain access inside the grace and beauty of God, then you will come to understand what it truly means when Jesus says, or when we say, that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of the living God. One of the ingredients of this cup, which Jesus drinks, is the cup of submission, giving our wills to God. Reflect on these words.